they're more likely to be hit by a meteor than get hepatitis B, unless they have a high-risk mother. If they don't have a high-risk mother, the chances of that child up until age 18 of getting hepatitis B is almost nothing. And the other thing was the hepatitis B vaccine they found didn't even give any protection past 2 years. So by the time the child reached the age of risk, the vaccine was no more use. So why were you vaccinating children at birth? They also found that when you give hepatitis B vaccine to a newborn baby, it changes their immune system. So at age 1 year, they still cannot mount an immune reaction to viruses. In other words, you ruin their immune system. And it can even last as long as 2 years after the vaccine. They can no longer react normally to protect themselves against infection. And we found that, in fact, the complication rate from the vaccine for hepatitis B actually greatly exceeded the disease itself. There was something like 16 times more complications from the vaccine than the disease itself. Now this is another example of ignored data. This was the Hib meningitis mortality rate. They stopped the DPT vaccine in Japan because of the high complication rate, and when they did, the number of children developing Hib meningitis fell precipitously. But we kept vaccinating. And then we said, well, look, there's a very high incidence of Hib. Now we need a Hib vaccine in every baby. And they were inducing the Hib disease. Chickenpox vaccine is another ridiculous vaccine. Chickenpox is an extremely mild childhood disease. Very rarely do you see any reactions to it that are serious. Yet they're vaccinating every child for chickenpox. If you get it as a child, you have lifelong immunity. If you get it as a vaccine, then you got to be continuously vaccinated. Of course, that sells a lot more vaccine. You can change the strain of the disease. For instance, the pneumococcal vaccine, that when you go to your doctor, they say, oh, you're 50 years old, you need to take the pneumococcal and the meningococcal vaccine. Which is absolutely ridiculous because there's 90 different strains of the meningococcus organism which can cause meningitis, and it just merely switches strains. The vaccine is good against only a few strains. And you may have heard recently, there's a big research project. When you hear this thing about 36,000 people dying of pneumonia, and so they wanted to see if the vaccine prevented pneumonia. They found it had no effect whatsoever, gave no protection. And it's interesting, the article ended, you still should get your flu vaccine. The nonsense about herd immunity, this is one that entertains me a lot. The herd immunity idea is that in order to protect our community, we have to vaccinate a certain percentage of the community, and that protects us against epidemics. In other words, it started out, it was about 60%. Then it went up to 75%. Then it went to 90%. Now they say 100% have to be vaccinated for herd immunity. Now, the interesting thing when I got to thinking about this, I said, you know, most of the kids who were vaccinated when I was growing up and Stan was growing up, their vaccine ran out long ago, 40, 50 years ago. So the vast majority of the people in this country have had no vaccine protection for most of their life. So we have not had herd immunity vaccination protection for over half of our population, probably higher than that. And no one ever looks back at that and says, well, herd immunity is true. Why hasn't there been mass epidemics of all these diseases since there's been no herd immunity in this country for 50 years? So it shows that the idea of herd immunity is sheer nonsense. This is just what you have to go through if you have a vaccine complication in order to report it to the federal government. You get down here and then it goes back up here and you start over. Now, of course, this is the little sweet picture they present to the parents. Oh, it's a nice little family thing. Bring Junior in, and we'll vaccinate him, and he'll be protected for life, and everybody will be happy. And how did they get mom to do it? They scared the daylights out of her. Oh, you didn't live during the period of polio. I had someone tell me I was in a court case testifying against vaccines. And they said, oh, you must not remember during the polio season. I said, well, I was a child in the height of the polio epidemic. So, in fact, Monroe, Louisiana had one of the highest ratios of polio of any city in the United States. And I said, well, I only had one child in my entire class that had polio. So, this is what they used. Of course, this is where they collected cases from multiple states. They brought them to big centers. And so you had large numbers of these iron lungs operating, but this was people drawn from 10, 15 states to this one center. But it makes a nice picture to scare the daylights out of mom. And of course, she's 25 years old, so she has no concept of the days of the polio outbreak. Now, the scare tactics, my favorite one is this 36,000 people dying of the flu every year. And of course, in 1986, 87 was the Hong Kong flu epidemic. There were 34,000 people died from the flu. So if 36,000 figures true, that means more people dying every year than in one of the worst 3 epidemics of flu deaths in American history. So when you look on their sites, you find out, well, there's not that many people dying of flu. In fact, it varies from a few hundred to as much as 1,000. That's all for the entire country. Then they changed their advertisement. They used to say die from the flu. Now they say die from the flu or its complications, which are implying pneumonia. And this new study showed that the vaccine did not protect against the pneumonia at all. Now, the other thing was that they did a 35-year study on the effectiveness of flu vaccine to prevent death. They followed it for 35 years. And, of course, as you got to the end of the 35 years, a lot more people had gotten the flu vaccine. What they found, there was no reduction in death rate at all, period. That never got into the media, and it was an article in the journals of Annals of Internal Medicine, a prestigious internal medicine journal, and you thought, well, doesn't this deserve to be in the media? Like you put these stories about measles increasing 152 cases. That deserves media attention, but not the fact that the flu vaccine is zero effective over 35 years of study. So this scare tactic is one of their major ways of doing it. And this is the vaccine safety manual. It'll tell you everything I can tell you and some more. So we'll stop there, and I don't know if you have any questions or not, but we'll entertain them.